So I just saw Spider-Man No Way Home, which is a movie that I have been hyped for ever since there was even a hint of, well, you know, them showing up. I'm also a huge fan of Tom Holland and the MCU Spider-Man movies, so I was excited for that reason as well. Okay, so where to begin? Let me first say two things. One, this review will have a spoiler talk section, but don't worry, I will warn you when we get there. And two, I am just going to put trailer footage over this commentary and not really go that hard on the edit, just for the sake of simplicity. I've had like 3 different reviews where I tried to go hard in the edit and then I didn't end up making the videos, so we're just going to do this instead so that I actually make the damn thing. So with that said, let's get into it. Spider-Man No Way Home is every bit as phenomenal as I anticipated it being, which is not to say that it is without its flaws, but it's just really damn good. This movie has just about everything you want and then some. The thing that stands out by far is the acting. The standout amongst that standout is Tom Holland, who had the best performance of his career, which is not exactly something that you would expect out of an MCU movie, but there are multiple scenes in this movie that demand some great acting, and Holland brings it and then some. I also really like what happens with Peter in this movie. While I never gave even a modicum of a shit about the Iron Boy Jr. criticism of Holland's Spider-Man, I still do prefer the character as more of his own man. This is absolutely the movie where Peter becomes his own hero, and it's because of that it really makes this trilogy feel like a prolonged origin story. Peter earns his stripes and really becomes Spider-Man over these 3 movies, and I think that retroactively makes the older movies better. I really don't know why people were expecting Spider-Man throughout high school through all 3 of these movies versus Spider-Man in high school through finishing college over the 3 Maguire movies would be like on the same tier. Maybe you like an older version of the character, which is fair, but comparing the 2 with drastically different circumstances and expecting them to be like the same never really made any sense to me. Either way, Holland killed it, and this is the best MCU Spidey that we have seen to date. Anyways, where was I? I kind of went on a tangent. Yeah, performances. Another big standout is Willem Dafoe. I cannot believe I am saying this, but Willem as Green Goblin was better in this movie than in Spider-Man 1. And I watched Spider-Man 1 like 3 days ago for a direct comparison. Part of this is it's just his performance, and then part of this is the tone of the movie as a whole. This movie takes its content more seriously, which is my biggest issue with the Raimi trilogy, is sometimes shit is just too silly and moments that are really not appropriate. Green Goblin is really goofy in Spider-Man 1, but with him being taken more seriously in this movie, he is fucking sinister. And there is one scene in particular in this movie with Goblin that is bone chilling. And if you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. And that is the standout of the performance, which stands out on its own. Looking elsewhere, Aunt May played a bigger role than I expected. Zendaya was really good as MJ, and if Zendaya is watching this, let me amend that statement and say that she was generational as MJ and that I am 8 inches taller than Tom Holland. Now, in terms of some negatives, I'd say the plot was a good bit simpler than I had anticipated. I was expecting things to get really complicated, and thus the pacing and the handling of the complexities of it would be the real challenge of this movie. But no, the plot ends up being pretty basic, which is fine, and it served its purpose. But also, with that being the case, it's weird that in spite of its simplicity, there were still struggles with pacing in this movie. The third act structure was really muddied, which to some extent can be good because it keeps you on your toes, and it's not cookie cutter, but it was also kind of hard to tell where the story was going and if there was going to be like another hour left or another half hour. Also, the editing on some of the shots were really weird. There is one really important and set up to be iconic shot to close the movie where they just kept cutting back and forth between 2 shots, and they cut back and forth like 4 times in total in the matter of 5 seconds of screen time. It was really distracting, and I think kind of ruined the scene. There were also moments where the sheer number of characters on screen paired with the fact that they all came from different universes was just a bit too jarring. There was one scene in particular where all of the villains were together and interacting with Peter, and it was so much that it stopped feeling like a movie and felt like a bunch of actors on a set, which is never a good thing. But all of those problems out of the way, this movie was great. The acting was amazing. The emotional moments were far more intense than I ever expected. This movie is actually really heartbreaking and sad at some points in ways that I was not ready for. And then as for everything else I loved, well, then we get into spoiler territory, so skip to this timestamp above you to see the final out of 10 score. Also, try not to spoil stuff in the comment section. I can't stop them, but if you're trying to avoid spoilers, maybe avoid the comment section. So with that said, spoilers in 3, 2, 1. Okay. First things first, we gotta talk about it. I know what we've all been speculating on, and it turned out to be true. Daredevil is in this movie. I know, I could not believe it either. Okay, for real, let's talk about Tobey and Garfield. Granted, I was genuinely hyped to see the main character in easily the best live-action superhero show ever made on the big screen. I really like Daredevil, and they need to give this man a season 4. But okay, Andrew and Tobey are indeed in this movie, which I would have geeked about more if it wasn't spoiled for me by a random YouTube recommendation, but it was still sick as fuck actually seeing them on screen again. For Andrew, seeing him on screen as Spider-Man again, and for Tobey, well, seeing him in literally any movie again. I'm going to have to say what really everyone has been saying. Andrew Garfield stole the fucking show, and honestly, he was so good that it made me reconsider how I feel about him as Spider-Man. I still take issue with how he's not really Peter Parker-like in his origin, but he really killed it in this role, especially by comparison to Tobey Maguire, who has me feeling kind of conflicted. Because to be frank, if I wasn't thinking, holy fuck, it's Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man again the whole time, I actually might have been a tad annoyed with him in this role. Part of this is just, it didn't feel like Tobey was in it. Maybe he was just more so there to collect a paycheck, and it really doesn't help that Tobey is by far the worst actor of the 3 Spider-Men. Like, I know Tobey is the guy from all of our childhoods, but he's actually just an okay actor, and he played a role that only really required an okay actor. But Andrew and Tom are both great actors and have proven that in projects outside of just Spider-Man, and Tobey by contrast appears weaker than he probably would have otherwise. So to me, Tobey was a smidge disappointing, but I was so caught up in the holy fuck, it's Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man again thing that I didn't actually notice it too much. Maybe if I watch this movie like a 5th time over, I'll feel a little bit differently. Back to Andrew though, he genuinely did so good that I hope he gets a new movie just as another Spider-Man, because why not? Who says there has to be one version of the character out there at once? I mean, technically Spider-Verse Peter is also there, so I really don't see any good reason for him not to have his own movie again. And apparently Andrew Garfield is open to something like that. Also, the scene where Andrew's Peter saves Tom's MJ and cries realizing that he saved her this time and he couldn't before, that shit got me, man. And that's in spite of the fact that Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a garbage fire that I haven't seen since I was like 13. I really can't praise Andrew's performance enough, and the 3 as a whole just had some amazing chemistry, and I really think Tobey Maguire was at his best when he was bouncing off of the other 2. There is one scene at the Statue of Liberty where they are waiting for the villains to show up and they're just kind of talking, and the chemistry was off of the fucking charts. Honestly, you could give me 2 hours of those 3 just talking about whatever and I would eat that shit up. It reminds me of the party scene in Avengers 2 where the Avengers are just hanging out. It's one of the few scenes in that movie that people just universally love. That's something the MCU as a whole doesn't get enough credit for. I'd say it's easy to look on the surface level with these movies because, well, a lot of the stuff in the MCU is pretty surface level, to be fair. However, I think people who dismiss the MCU act as though it's just a bunch of nerds who want to watch a CGI fight between comic book characters, which sure, that is a big draw, but for me, and I think most people, whether they even realize it or not, the draw is the characters. In almost any bad superhero movie, MCU or otherwise, very rarely is the main character done really well. In fact, it's often the biggest problem. Looking at the MCU, for example, Thor in his first 2 movies is an awful and bland character, and in Ragnarok, he's fucking great. Coincidentally, one movie is better than the other 2. You can make a perfectly mediocre superhero movie if the plot and the characters kind of suck, but the main character is done really well. The thing that the MCU rarely gets wrong, and even when they do, they pretty much always correct it, is its characters. Plot is hit or miss, and to be honest, probably more often miss if anything. And I'd actually say that this movie's plot was kind of Villains from the multiverse are here, I don't want to send them back to their death, so I'll cure their powers and then send them back to live. That's a basic synopsis of that plot, and it's nothing special. But the character work in this movie is so universally good outside of maybe Toby, and that's what makes it so fucking good. Real quick, I want to talk about two more things that I couldn't really fit within the flow of the script. First of all, Aunt May dying was honestly perfect from plot perspective. It really gave a dire consequence for Peter's mistakes, which is a big part in him growing up. And I realize why some might not like it, but I loved Aunt May being the one to deliver the "with great power comes great responsibility" line. It shows how much the writers are willing to mess with the formula, which despite what some nerds might think, is a good thing. Who says Ben has to be the one to deliver that line? Aunt May is just as much responsible for who Peter becomes, and I thought it was great. If a bit forced for the fact that she dies like right after it, but it was good overall. Also, I think that line being dropped in this movie further emphasizes my point about these three movies really being Peter's origins. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was the ending, another point where I take some issue. If I'm not mistaken, the original spell was supposed to make people forget that Peter Parker was Spider-Man, so why did it end up having to be that people forgot Peter Parker altogether? Maybe that was explained and I missed it, but it felt like that was forced. Again, I might have just missed it, so let me know. Also, fucking RIP to dudes named Peter Parker who are just like accountants. Whole family forgets who they are and they aren't even Spider-Man. Anyways, all of that said, overall, I do love the ending. It's perhaps the most MCU Spidey has felt like a Tobey Raimi Spidey, which again, I actually like MCU Spider-Man more, but that's really because I think the character is written and performed better, but the circumstances around Peter are more ideal in the Raimi movies than in the MCU movies in terms of the overall atmosphere of that character. So if we're getting something even remotely like Holland's Peter in a more Tobey Peter type of environment, to me that is the best of both worlds, and it could be the formula for the perfect Spider-Man movie. Anyway, let's get to my score, and I think the way I have to do this is similar to how I reviewed The Last of Us Part 2. I have to remove my biases and look at it as objectively as possible with nostalgia removed. Now, I'd be the first to tell you that objectivity in media criticism is horseshit. It's not real. Everything about art is subjective, but I can also acknowledge that there is shit that I wouldn't let slide if I didn't have immense nostalgia for a lot of the elements in this film. So I don't want to let that interfere with my true thoughts with the nostalgia fog removed from the equation. So with that said, my Spider-Man No Way Home review with nostalgia removed from the equation is an 8 out of 10. Really, really, really good with amazing acting, but a few genuine flaws that hold it back from being quite a masterpiece. But how I felt with nostalgia making me as blind as Peter Parker before he got bit by the spider, it's a 10 out of 10 without question. I have so much love for this character, and seeing a movie that was a love letter to Spider-Man that knew exactly how to play with my emotions, it was a great time and I cannot wait to see it again.